Hello, and welcome to DGT Podcast, Languages and Technology, brought to you by the European Commission's Translation Department. My name is Anna Holmén, and in this episode we will talk about clear writing and plain language. I'm joined in the studio today by Edward Love, a European Commission colleague working as a speechwriter in the Commission's Department for Justice and Consumers. Edward is also a member of our Clear Writing Network, which DG Translation set up to try and reach every nook and corner of our organization with our plain language message. Edward, welcome. Please tell us your language story and how that took you to the European Commission.
Thank you, Anna. Really pleased to be here with you today and looking forward to our conversation. So I suppose people who've known me for a long time might actually be surprised that I work with and around language all the time. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I grew up in England, in the United Kingdom, in a region called East Anglia, and that was a very monolingual environment to grow up in. And of course, other people who have grown up on an island might also understand the sense that foreign language is something that is elsewhere, and there are very hard borders, so to say. And it wasn't actually before I got to high school that I was really exposed to foreign language, so not my first language of English. And have to admit that French was my worst subject at school at that time. So I had a lot of progress to make in the time that followed school. But I always loved language variety. But there was also a passion for reading when I was younger and lots of theatre. So there were worlds of language for themselves in these books and also for others on stage in front of an audience. And that really opens up, I think, new worlds, as said, beyond individual imagination. That then led me to a passion for history, specifically for ancient Egypt, which opened up a whole new avenue of inquiry about languages that were once spoken and written and are now long dead. And that was the basis of my studies. So I studied actually Egyptology as an undergraduate and graduate, and this passion and these studies led me to Germany, where I took up a research career. And my research interests at that time were bilingualism in ancient Egypt, language death, so how it is that languages can actually die out even after being spoken and sometimes written for a very long time, and also something called script obsolescence, so why do things become obsolete, like the fax machine, for example, but in this case, a script or a writing system, as well as other areas of research that ultimately led to questions of justice in the ancient world, in ancient Egypt, and how people might petition gods to get justice if they were denied it in the earthly realm. Ultimately, I decided to transition from my love of ancient Egypt to pursue my passion for law, also at a European and international level. So after doing an LLM, so that's a Master of Laws in European and International Law.
So it's not a large language model.
No, indeed, quite. I came to the European Commission as a trainee in the area of criminal justice, and after more than a year in that area, I am now, as you said, a speechwriter and also working in communications. So one can often say that things make sense in the rearview mirror, and there's a red thread there from a very monolingual environment to an interest and love of languages that comes perhaps due to the absence of exposure to that, all the way through to research areas that ultimately led to this career transition and why I'm sitting here today.
I think there are several podcast episodes in that story, starting in not quite starting in ancient Egypt, but then ending up here in the European Commission and still being able to draw from all these experiences. And I have to make a personal note and say also that you mentioned theatre, and of course that's an excellent way of acquiring various skills that then turns out to be useful in your professional life. Maybe we should move to today's topic, and in this conversation we might be using several expressions like clear writing, clear language and plain language. But as we today will focus on written text, we might refer more to clear writing, even if, of course, for clear communication, visuals, layout, and so on, it matters a lot too. I'd like to ask you, Edward, why is clear language, clear writing so important for an organization like ours, for the European Commission and the EU institutions in general?
I think for two main reasons. And the first one is why it's important for us in our work. I think that if we can write clearly, we can also show that we can think clearly. And we have a huge body of different policies and different laws that we're responsible for. And we have an enormous number of stakeholders, so the people that matter to our policy and to this law. And we need to address everything to them as best as we can. We need to talk directly to them as our audience. But in trying to write clearly, it's a test for us or a process for whether we have understood what it is we're trying to say to our audience or those so-called stakeholders. And so the second main reason is because it's important for our audiences. And as said, we have to communicate to so many different audiences. In the first instance, we have more than 450 million individual stakeholders, individual people living in the European Union. They might be citizens of the European Union, they might be residents in Europe. And on top of that, we have public and private media, we have civil society, we have non-governmental organizations and international organizations, public authorities perhaps as well, businesses, unions, groupings of lawyers, all these different constellations of people, of so-called stakeholders that we need to write for and thereby communicate to. And that's across, when we only think internally, 27 member states and 24 official languages. And all of those individual people represent all ages, all backgrounds, all feasible degrees of familiarity with our work or ability to engage with our work, whether they have some time to think about it or no time at all. And of course, all the work we do is for them. So we have to think about how we are approaching it ourselves to make things clear to ourselves in order to be clear to all of those audiences. And if you talk to them in their language, I think this fulfills our first duty to be transparent about the work we're doing. And we do go to great lengths to be transparent. And an example of that is that all law is available in all official languages. The idea of this transparency is, of course, to build trust. We are very open to criticism and dissent and discussion and debate, but we do need citizens to trust what we're doing sometimes. But of course, first and foremost, we need to earn that trust. And communication is a huge part of that. And plain language is often the basis of that communication.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned trust, and that's really at the heart of it, I think. But sometimes it's kind of just mentioned like that, and it might not be clear to everyone the link between clear writing and trust. But if you imagine, a member of the public being presented with an EU text which is incomprehensible to them, this creates a distance, and there is even the risk that they think it is done deliberately. I'd like to play a 2-minute clip from one of our sister podcasts, the EU Finance podcast, where the host Aidas Palubinskas chats with Dimitrios Chaidas about the EU Sanctions Help Desk and the added value of that help desk for small and medium enterprises.
The terminology of sanctions, terms like due diligence, funds restriction, national competent authorities, and so on and so on. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of terms that are used by us in the Commission, you in the help desk, in the legal profession, and in big companies with big legal in-houses. But there's an awful lot of people in SMEs that have little to no experience in that sort of legal terminology. How are you going to get it across to them what is meant by what? I mean, how do you get SMEs to understand these very important words that others just bandy about willy-nilly?
That's a great question. Actually, when we were first starting to conceptualize the website, we did research to see what's out there. So we try to get ourselves in the shoes of an SME, which, as you said, they lack resources that big companies have. And we're trying to say, okay, if you're an SME in the Netherlands, in Greece, in Ireland, and you want to find some information related to due diligence, how do you find it? Is it easy to find? And what we found was that there's a lot of information out there. It's not that we lack information, but sometimes this information is scattered all over the web. And what we try to do is to build a website that brings together different pieces of information that are useful for an SME, but also understandable and accessible.
So that was an example of some colleagues who have to tackle the challenge of how to get with the communication, with the content, with a message to their target audience.
For me, this clip is about ensuring that information is accessible in the first instance, and then useful when our so-called stakeholders have access to it. So when it comes to terminology like due diligence or national competent authorities that may belong in a particular world, but is quite siloed in that world, we need to understand what is meant by what in order to be able to communicate that to our audiences. Some of our written text and language is for specialists, and I think that's okay.
We mentioned before the general public, but we also have an audience that is more specialists.
So we heard in the help desk that even the reference to small and medium enterprises, the SMEs, are a group of stakeholders that have particular characteristics, and we need to give them the information they need in their particular context and for the work that they do. But every time we do that, we have to be clear that we define our terms, especially, of course, our jargon, and that we make those definitions clear, so unambiguous, essentially, and we make them consistent, so they can depend on these definitions, and we make them accessible, which means, of course, that they're actually easy to understand, and that the definition is not just an elaboration of what the word encompasses in the first instance. So I think as an example here, because we're talking about the sanctions help desk, we have a term in the EU which is restrictive measures, and we now have a directive on the definition of criminal offences and penalties for the violation of union restrictive measures. Now that is of course a mouthful, so it's our responsibility to explain what that is. And the directive is a piece of law which I'll just skip over for the moment, because within that it's where we find the definition of terms. So if we go to this directive, we can find what union restrictive measures means in Article 2.1, and we can see that their restrictive measures are defined elsewhere in the Article 215 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, so one of our founding treaties of the European Union. And in that article, we have a description, well, a definition of what restrictive measures are: the interruption or reduction, in part or completely, of economic and financial relations with one or more third countries. And I was able to find that information very quickly, but of course I knew where to find it. And that's really, really important about accessibility. I think this language is unambiguous, and it is certainly consistent across these documents, but it has to also be accessible. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we explain also in plain language, in clear terms, where this language is available. That's what we mean with this definition. And clear writing is not, in these technical contexts about dumbing down language. Clear language shouldn't be confused with vague language. In fact, it needs to be very clear, which means also precise. And then when we come to a wider audience, we need to make sure that our written text, our language, is also accessible to what I would call generalists, so everyone else in different areas. To be clear, we need to give citizens access to resources to understand exactly what we mean, because very often we mean exactly that or only that. And of course, in the English-speaking world especially, lots of people mean lots of things by the words they use, and we don't necessarily know what others mean when they're using those same words. And in the Directorate General, so the department that I work in, we cover justice, democracy, fundamental rights, consumer protection, a huge portfolio, and we need to be clear in our language what we're referring to, and we use the term, for example, fundamental rights, because that relates to a Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union that we have that provides particular rights. And of course, these overlap very closely with human rights, which is a term that will be perhaps much more broadly known, for example, as covered by the European Convention on Human Rights. And we also have articles in that charter that explain what we mean. So, for example, Article 11 refers to freedom of expression and information. Then Article 11.1 of the charter then explains what that right to freedom of expression really means. And again, this is a definition that's available in all official languages and is available online, and makes very clear to every citizen, every resident, every other stakeholder in the European Union, and of course also broadly around the world, what we mean when we say freedom of expression. So that's that it shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. So that's ultimately about our responsibility to help our audience understand what we mean. And there are perhaps two other examples of that. One would be inclusive language, so making sure our language does not exclude people, and then also accessible language, so making sure that the written text that we produce is available and accessible in the sense that we have versions that are open to groups of people with very different requirements. And a really nice example of that recently is our gender equality strategy, and colleagues in the Directorate General, so in our department for justice and under the equality portfolio, worked really hard with colleagues in the publications office to make sure that when we went out and we asked citizens their views about what should be in this new gender equality strategy, we produced a version that was easy to read for them and ask questions in a way that also explained to them how they could answer these questions. Because we want our consultations, so when we ask members of the public questions, we want those to be as open as possible so we can get as much input as possible from as broad an audience as possible. And it's our responsibility to make sure that we make that process, as said, as easy as possible.
Okay, so you are working with focus groups where you go out and ask people, and then take that input when in your work when you produce text.
I suppose when we do a consultation, so when we go out to ask the public as individuals, or we ask stakeholders in a targeted way, so they might be civil society organisations, they might be non-governmental organisations, etc., about their views on particular policy or particular legal formulations, that's a chance for us to also test the resources that we're providing. So how successful was this easy-to-read version that we produced in getting, shall we say, larger uptake of the questionnaire than previously when we hadn't provided an easy-to-read version. So although we might not be asking all of those citizens their views on the format, so to say, of the document, we can also sort of tell in hard numbers by uptake of these easy-to-read versions how successful they've been in actually reaching a wider audience.
We've heard some very convincing arguments of why we should write clearly. So let's go into how we do that, because there are tips and tricks, and we have 10 golden rules of clear writing that we are constantly recommending all around the European Commission. Edward, could we perhaps go through the golden rules, which will for sure be useful for many people who write?
Okay, so the first one is plan before you write. And this seems quite obvious to say it out loud, but we often just want to crack on with our tasks and we don't necessarily give it the kind of thought that perhaps we should, certainly in hindsight, once we've started to produce something. This is about being clear about your purpose, your audience, and your message. So think about what your readers need to know or need to do in response. And I think that also means don't forget there are things that they don't need to know. You don't need to overload them with information. So why are you writing? What is the issue to answer with this policy program that we're proposing or we are consulting about? Is there a time-sensitive announcement that we need to get across to? And again, the audience, who are you writing for? What are you writing about? And interesting for me is that this often comes last. What are you writing about? It's not just a list of what should be included, it's a consideration of why we're writing now and who we're writing for.
And for some people it even helps visualizing someone. This is the person that I'm writing for, whoever that may be, someone who represents the group of people you are writing for. And as you said before, if it's a specialist audience, then of course you can allow yourself to use more technical language and so on. You don't have to always stick to the easiest for the biggest group. But if you have that target audience clear, then that's really your boundaries.
Number 2 is structure your text. Use headings, subheadings, use bullet points, and don't be afraid of leaving white space. It helps to organize your ideas and also to guide your reader. I think we can all remember that whether it was university or school, we're taught to write in paragraphs and to string sentences together into tightly formed paragraphs that fill a page convincingly. But there's no need to confront a reader with a wall of text. And so we shouldn't be afraid of laying things out in a way that is beneficial for readability. And when it comes to structuring your text, there's this old phrase I keep being reminded of: don't bury the lead. So remember that every text has a beginning, middle, and end, and start with the important thing and proceed from there.
And number 3.
That's keep it short and simple. So we advise to use one main idea per sentence and aim for shorter sentences, 15 to 20 words perhaps.
That is my problem. That is where I always have to go back and see, okay, how many things are you trying to say here, Anna? And I can often find, like 3 thoughts in one sentence. And that has it's really helped me, that particular tip, to, always apply it when I've written something and put some full stops here and there and some bullet points.
Exactly, and that goes back to it being how we're taught to string together subordinate clauses. So, put a comma and carry on your sentence rather than put a full stop and start a new one. And the idea is essentially we can do this by avoiding long or complex sentences that can confuse readers, right? They can introduce ambiguity, and that's unnecessary. So just write shorter sentences. It's very much against our training, perhaps, but we can do it. And we're also taught to use sort of elaborate formulations in text when we could just use more to the point vocabulary. Why say in view of the fact that when you can just say because? There's a cause and effect there. So keeping it short and simple is a tricky one, and it also relates nicely though to structure your text. If you can write a bullet point list, then you can indent the related thoughts underneath, say, a main point, rather than stringing everything together as a set of long sentences in a big paragraph.
And number 4.
This is choose verbs, not nouns. So prefer active verbs in your writing instead of using these heavy noun phrases. This keeps your writing lively and also allows it to be more direct. So I've got some examples here collected by colleagues, as well as a couple of my own favorites. So don't provide some clarification on when you can just clarify something, or don't carry out an analysis when you can just analyze. Don't pose a question when you can just ask.
Yeah. And then number 5.
This is favor the active voice. Show who is performing the action whenever possible to make sentences clear and precise. Of course, we all understand that avoiding the active voice might have political reasons, but usually there is a cause and effect. So X causes Y, or A prevents B, and there's really no need to introduce passive agents. So A has been published by B. You could just say that the Commission has published the following thing.
Yeah, and I think that goes back also to what we spoke about before about trust. Who took this decision, or who did this, who introduced this measure. So I think that's an important point there. And number 6.
Be specific. So avoid vague or abstract terms. Use concrete words that make your meaning clear. So if something will have a positive impact on something else, that means it will improve it, essentially, right? And this, I think, also applies to these sort of superficially higher register terms that we're often encouraged to use. Especially when writing English, the dictionary is very large, with words from all kinds of different languages borrowed over time. But why does something have to have a provenance when it can just have an origin? And why does something have to be novel when it can just be new? And why do we have to utilize something when we can just use it? So I think this also relates to choosing verbs, not nouns. It's just thinking about what is the most direct way to express what it is we're trying to say.
Yeah, and then we come to number 7, which I think is a bit typical for multilingual organizations, something that we specifically need to think about here.
Absolutely. So number 7 is watch out for false friends. And this is my absolute favorite. And as said, ever since I was very young, I was fascinated by language variety, so different accents and different dialects. And essentially we have English here spoken in a multilingual environment, as you say, with 24 official languages and many more other languages on top. So we have English of more than 24 varieties being spoken. And the fantastic thing, I think, personally, about the English language is that there is no prescriptive academy saying how the English language should or shouldn't be spoken. and which words can or can't be used. And when the Oxford English Dictionary was compiled, it was deliberately to be descriptive. So how is the language used, not how should it be used? So this all comes together under this particular golden rule. And I brought some examples together. But first, I suppose I should explain what false friends are. So these are words that look familiar, or indeed might be correct, but still mean something different in the standard norms of the English that we are using in the Commission. And so we might understand each other as colleagues, and we often do, because of course in a multilingual environment, colleagues with different first languages will understand things translated one for one into English. But again, it's about our wider audience, and we need to think about them. And when false friends might also relate to the need to explain technical terms. They might be clearer in one language than in another. So I have a couple of my favorite examples. The first is when I was asked to please resume. So the colleague meant to summarize the following thing. And so that's from French résumé. But resume, for me at least, in the English that I grew up with, means that you've just paused something, you need to carry on. And then we were also asked once to dislocate, which was meant to say that we needed to relocate or to move. So again, that's borrowed from French, but in my English norms, shall we say, dislocation is what happens when your bone pops out of your joint. So the need to dislocate as an email subject came as quite a surprise. And then we were asked to consult to look at some outtakes. So this is from German Auszüge, and the colleague meant excerpts or extracts from a particular text, but outtakes are the short reels that come at the end of movies or TV shows when the actors are making mistakes and having a good laugh about it. So there are a couple of outtakes from our podcast as well today. And then there, as well as false friends, something I really want to mention briefly, there are also inventions. Things that make very good sense in context, and this is how language evolves, but aren't perhaps what the colleague meant directly. So someone saying that we needed to be trustful in our work, so they meant they're loyal, of course, and that a situation produced a certain amount of uncomfortability. Again, one can understand exactly what is meant, but one might say that discomfort would have been a clearer way to say it, because that's a word you can at least find in the dictionary.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes you hear colleagues who speak English, native speakers of English, after a few years in the commission, in the institutions, they start picking up those words, those invented or created words here, which might come as comfort to in many of our countries, people are discussing the influence that English has on their languages. Of course, here's the other way around. Here our language, our 24 language, or 23 languages are influencing the English that we speak here, which creates, some really, from a linguist, some very beautiful expressions. So I'm Swedish, and beer in Swedish is öl, and of course in German, öl means oil, and there are very few Swedes who haven't at one point in their life ordered a glass of oil in Germany. I guess that many German pubs have by now learned what is needed when a Swede comes in and asks for a glass of oil. Yeah. And now we come to number 8, and I have to climb up on the barricades, because this is something I try to fight against as much as I can.
Yes, that's beware of jargon.
People don't realize how fast you get caught in the jargon jungle. You start using those words after first you come here and you're confused and you don't know what's meant, and it doesn't take long before you start using it left and right. You say DG for Directorate General, and even Directorate General is not very understandable for an outside audience. I usually say a commission department because I think that's clearer. And I've heard once an EU commissioner making a joke about Blue Book trainees in a member state. And of course, Blue Book trainee, it's the word that we use specifically in the European Commission for our interns. People don't even say trainees outside here, but we say Blue Book trainee. And once you're here, it makes sense. But if you use it to an outside audience, it's not so clear.
Yes, indeed. So it's really about minimizing administrative, corporate, technical terms as far as is possible. And when that's not possible, just explain what is meant in the first instance, whether it's spelling something out and then putting the abbreviation behind it in brackets, or whether it's saying, this is a particular agency that does particular work, and then just referring to that agency throughout the text as an agency subsequently. We don't need to keep using these in an external context. And of course, even in an internal one, we might want to spell things out for colleagues, especially those who are new to the institutions.
And number 9.
Avoid abbreviations and acronyms. So this relates closely to number 8, and it's about using acronyms and abbreviations only really when necessary, and just making sure that you write out the full term the first time it appears, and again putting abbreviations in brackets behind the word once you've introduced it, or the term once you've introduced it, and making sure that you don't overload your text with abbreviations. Otherwise it might just seem to be a collection of nouns all strung together and completely incomprehensible.
And finally, number 10.
That's revise and check. Of course, we're all working to deadlines under certain time pressure, but ideally you should reread your text and ensure that you have that beginning, middle and end, right? That the ideas flow, that the questions that you're writing about are actually answered in the text, and that the language is as clear as it can be, therefore, but also, of course, free of errors.
Thank you. And these rules are really clear, and it shouldn't be impossible to follow them. But we've already touched upon some specific issues that we have in our organizations, some of which we might share with other multicultural and multilingual organizations. Do you have any examples of that?
So relating to many things we've spoken about already, as we go through school and perhaps into university if we go, and maybe even into research if we stay at university, we're trained to write increasingly complex texts to increasingly narrow audiences. And so we might end up in what I could call a semantic silo, where everyone knows what they mean, but it doesn't transfer out. And that relates to abbreviations and jargon and the things we've talked about already. It's really important to break out of those and put ourselves in the shoes of our audience. We're often working to tight deadlines and within changing sets of requirements and expectations, but it's all about the audience at the end of the day. So this should be the beginning and the end of our thought process, and also our drafting and rewriting process. In an institution like the European Commission, there are lots of people who are involved in producing pieces of policy or communications or whatever it might be. And that of course means that there are multiple authors and even more colleagues who are involved in contributing ideas or checking elements of a text. But it's very difficult if you end up with a text written by committee to have a clear message. And the clear message is crucial, because without the clear message, what is it actually that you're trying to get across to your audience? So it's about thinking from the perspective of the audience as much as possible, and then in the actual process, making sure that some particular clear voice comes out. And when it comes to these semantic silos I was talking about, so we all understand what each other means in our particular work environment, we also have to overcome the what's often called curse of expertise or curse of knowledge. So forgetting what it's like not to know something. That applies to jargon, that applies to acronyms, that applies to words that we use internally in these semantic silos where everyone understands the common reference. Have you ever had a teacher who insists something is easy? Because once I was sitting in a language class at university and the professor was trying to explain to me how particular grammatical construction worked. And after I and other co-years of mine struggled with it a little bit, the professor insisted, come on, it's not that hard. It's just like in medieval German.
Yeah, which we all speak daily. So, and in your Director General, as we jargonly call it, of Justice and Consumers, how do you work with plain language?
I'm quite a strong convert to the cause of plain language, precisely because as a first language speaker of English, you stumble over yourself all the time. It does have its advantages, but when it comes to getting to the point, not always. So when we come together to then actually start with the drafting, we have a clear idea of if we're writing for a commissioner or directly to our stakeholders. So for example, civil society organizations, or we're addressing what we're writing directly to the media, so to the press. And we do give each other feedback on that. And we do, with these shared edited documents suggest different ways of formulating in order to make the message clearer. And we do, where possible, try to have someone who's responsible for making sure there is that sort of consistent voice, that sort of authentic, clear message that goes throughout, that joins up the beginning, middle and end, even though the middle might be a lot of really substantive input.
Oh, that's excellent. So it's like an artistic director. Making sure that you have that voice. That's a very good suggestion, actually. So thank you very much, Edward.
Thank you, Anna.
We have been going through the clear writing rules that we use in the European Commission. And I would like to add that within the Commission, we also have training sessions and events and a newsletter on clear language, which we in the translation department offer to our colleagues. And recently we beefed up our team of language editors that are editing texts for other Commission departments. And on top of that, we have a range of AI tools that are available for a limited external audience. And a couple of them are useful for clear language, like the web text and the accessible text. Though these tools are available for public administrations, universities, small and medium enterprises and non-governmental organizations. And for anyone who happens to be listening to this before the 2nd of November 2025, you should sign up to virtually attend our conference, Clear Language at TEF. It is a half-day special program that opens our 3-day conference Translating Europe Forum. So thank you very much, Edward. And thank you to our audience for listening to DGT Podcast, Languages and Technology. Stay in touch and share your thoughts and questions on Instagram or Facebook at Translating for Europe. Don't forget to subscribe in your preferred podcast app to stay updated on EU multilingualism and translation topics. Until next time.